Welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber CRISC Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. Third-party risk matters because it expands your organization's exposure in ways that go beyond your internal control systems. In other words, your risk perimeter grows every time you rely on an outside group. Anytime an external entity accesses your data, systems, or business processes, your risk perimeter expands. In other words, the surface area of potential compromise becomes larger. This creates dependency risk, where failures or weaknesses in third parties directly affect your organization. In other words, you are now vulnerable to events you cannot fully control. This is especially important in cases where data is shared, systems are integrated, or operations are outsourced. In other words, the more they touch, the more risk they bring. Regulations such as the General Data Protection Regulation, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and standards like Service Organization Control Reports often require third-party risk controls. In other words, the law expects you to manage third-party risk formally. A failure by a third party can cause legal trouble, operational disruption, financial loss, or damage to your reputation. In other words, your organization pays the price even when someone else causes the problem. On the CRISC exam, third-party risks are often hidden inside scenarios involving vendors, cloud services, or partnerships. In other words, you have to spot them inside other stories. You must identify where risk moves outside the organization's boundary and how that changes evaluation and monitoring. In other words, recognize when the control shifts to someone else and adapt your strategy. Third parties include any external individuals or organizations that interact with your assets, data, or systems. In other words, anyone outside your payroll who touches your environment. This list includes vendors, contractors, service providers, cloud platforms, consultants, and strategic partners. In other words, many different roles can create risk. Even long-term or trusted vendors can introduce vulnerabilities or compliance problems. In other words, trust does not eliminate exposure. As the level of access, system integration, or data sensitivity increases, the risk they bring also increases. In other words, deeper connections bring higher stakes. In CRISC scenarios, a line like "the vendor-hosted sensitive data" is your signal to evaluate that relationship for risk. In other words, hosting critical data means shared liability. Understanding what entities count as third parties helps you recognize exposure during procurement, implementation, or operational review. In other words, classification helps guide attention and effort. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. There are many different types of third-party risk to consider. In other words, you must evaluate risk from several perspectives. Operational risk includes service outages, failure to meet service-level agreements, and lack of support. In other words, you could lose services or fall short of expectations. Cybersecurity risk comes from poor access controls, the possibility of malware, or insecure interfaces between systems. In other words, third parties can open your environment to attackers. Compliance risk includes failures to meet data protection laws, data residency problems, or undocumented practices. In other words, poor practices can put you out of legal alignment. Strategic risk occurs when a third party does not align with your business values, priorities, or ethical standards. In other words, they might make decisions that reflect poorly on your organization. And financial risk includes issues like vendor insolvency, unexpected pricing changes, or overdependence on a single provider. In other words, they might disappear or become too costly. Each of these risks can appear in CRISC scenarios, so you must know how to identify and describe them. In other words, watch for hints that show any of these exposures are active. The process of identifying third-party risks should begin early, during vendor selection, onboarding, or even project planning. In other words, waiting until later is already too late. This step should involve stakeholders from procurement, legal, information technology, risk management, and the relevant business units. In other words, it must be a shared process across departments. Standard tools for this process include risk rating matrices, due diligence checklists, and service classification models. In other words, structured templates help make good decisions. You should tier your vendors based on the criticality of their service and how much sensitive data they can access. In other words, the more they matter, the higher the oversight. On the exam, expect questions that ask when to identify these risks. In other words, timing is a major clue. The best answer will almost always involve early identification. In other words, prevention is better than correction. Catching these risks later in the life cycle often leads to missed contracts, audit failures, or inadequate mitigation. In other words, delayed identification usually ends badly. Due diligence is how you assess a third party before signing a contract. In other words, you check their risks before committing. You might review audit reports such as SOC 2 or certifications like ISO 27711. In other words, third-party assurance documents can tell you a lot. You should ask about how they handle data, where it is stored, and whether they have experienced past breaches. In other words, learn how they operate and what history they carry. You should confirm that their practices align with relevant legal and regulatory requirements. In other words, make sure your rules are their rules too. Also evaluate their ability to respond to incidents and manage controls effectively. In other words, know whether they are prepared. On the CRISC exam, look for signs that due diligence was skipped. These often result in costly surprises after the contract is signed. In other words, poor vetting leads to poor results. To evaluate third-party risk, start by asking what systems and data the third party will access. In other words, define their entry points. Next, examine the controls they already have in place to protect that access. In other words, verify their security posture. Then, ask whether they can meet your security, privacy, and regulatory requirements. In other words, check alignment with your baseline. Also consider their financial and operational health. Can they deliver over time? In other words, make sure they are stable and capable. In exam scenarios, phrases like "the vendor lacked formal policies" usually point to a breakdown in risk evaluation. In other words, missing controls are your clue that vetting failed. Risk mitigation must be built into the contract. In other words, your agreements must address risk directly. Use contractual language to define service expectations, how data will be handled, what happens in a breach, and when notifications are required. In other words, your protections should be in writing. You should also include the right to audit the third party, termination clauses, liability limits, and indemnity terms. In other words, contracts should give you leverage and options. Internally, someone must be assigned to own and monitor the relationship. In other words, ongoing responsibility does not belong to the vendor. Contracts do not eliminate risk, they structure who is responsible for managing it. In other words, contracts define control, not immunity. CRISC questions may ask whether proper mitigation was put in place before the agreement was signed. In other words, your exam answer should reflect good preparation. If not, that is often the reason the organization later encounters problems. In other words, weak contracts cause downstream trouble. Once a vendor is onboarded, third-party risk does not stop. It must be monitored on an ongoing basis. In other words, the process continues after the signature. You should perform periodic reassessments and compliance reviews using updated questionnaires, site visits, or automated security scans. In other words, use multiple tools to stay informed. Tracking key indicators like service level performance, incident history, and access behavior helps detect problems early. In other words, key risk indicators highlight emerging threats. Vendor risk management systems can support this process by consolidating alerts and data across vendors. In other words, tools help scale oversight across many providers. CRISC scenarios often test whether this continuous monitoring took place. In other words, you may be asked whether risk was still being tracked. If a vendor was not reviewed again after onboarding, that is usually a red flag. In other words, early vetting is not enough by itself. Even with monitoring, risk events may still occur. If a third party violates contract terms or causes a breach, the incident response plan must be activated. In other words, your contingency process must begin. This includes assessing the impact, notifying affected parties, and launching any necessary remediation steps. In other words, act fast to contain and communicate. You must document what happened, update the risk register, and revise treatment strategies as needed. In other words, lessons learned must be recorded. If the risk becomes too large or unmanageable, it may be necessary to terminate the relationship. In other words, sometimes the safest option is to end the engagement. In the exam, clues like the breach occurred but was not escalated point to failures in oversight or unclear ownership. In other words, missing follow-up is a common cause of escalation failure. In CRISC scenarios involving third-party risk, look for signs of gaps in evaluation, ownership, or monitoring. In other words, most failures begin with something not being done. If the organization failed to assess a vendor's controls, that is a due diligence failure. In other words, they signed without looking closely. If no one inside the organization is assigned to oversee the third party, that is a governance gap. In other words, lack of ownership leads to lack of action. When asked which contract term is most important, breach notifications, audit rights, and liability protections are good answers. In other words, these terms help manage outcomes when something goes wrong. If onboarding is being discussed, the right step is to assess, classify, and document risks before any contract is signed. In other words, always evaluate before engaging. Strong answers will always reflect proactive evaluation, role clarity, and ongoing visibility into the relationship. In other words, success comes from doing the right things early and continuing them over time. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cyber CRISC Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.